Good morning and welcome to our final session of the Women in Politics Journalism Fellowship. We have two speakers this morning. Sonya Ross is stuck in traffic, as we all have been at various points this week, but she will be here. But we are very lucky to start with Susan Page. Susan is the White House Bureau Chief for Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. She has covered 11 presidential elections. 12. I shouldn't even do this. 12 presidential elections. So is it still 7 White House administrations?
Yes.
Okay, good. And has interviewed 10 presidents, not all while they've been in office, because that would age you quite a bit. But still incredibly impressive. She's been president of the White House Correspondents Association and the Gridiron. She is the author of 3 biographies, which are, I have to say, done in such a journalistic way. It's basically like just extremely long form journalism. Barbara Bush, the matriarch, Nancy Pelosi, Madam Speaker, and her new one, which she's just about to go on tour for, Barbara Walters, the rule breaker. So we're very lucky that she had time for us today. She also has traveled basically all over the world, 6 continents, doing what she does. I'm just really excited to have you here. This is you've obviously covered women in politics, but have also been kind of a groundbreaker yourself. And so anyway, with that, I'm going to let her get started. But please join me in welcoming Susan Page.
So the last panel on a 3-day conference, so you're probably really sick of people sitting up here and talking. So let me just talk for a couple minutes and then hopefully open it up to questions, which is probably more interesting. First, congratulations on being here. I know this is a great program and an honor to be selected for, and I think probably invaluable to do. It's so, I'm from Wichita, Kansas. It's great to see people here from places other than Washington, D.C., because all the great journalism in America is not done in Washington, D.C. A lot of it is done in places like Salt Lake City and Omaha and San Antonio, and I'm really pleased to be here. So thinking about the topic of women in politics, I went back to pull the statistics from the Rutgers site last night about where things stood when I arrived in Washington. I arrived in Washington in 1979, working for Newsday, the newspaper in New York. And at that time, women were 2 governors, so 4% of governors, 1 senator, Nancy Kassebaum from my home state of Kansas, and 16 House members, which is about 3.5% of the total in the House. Those numbers are so low as to be non-existent. No woman had ever been nominated for the presidency or the vice presidency by a major party ticket. No women had ever served in the top leadership in Congress. Women did not have enough numbers to have much of a force. Now compare it to now. We have 12 governors, 25 senators, so 25% of the total, and 126 House members, also about 25% of the total. And you can look at this in 2 ways. You can look at, oh my God, look how big the numbers have gotten compared to 1979. Or you can look at it and say, what, 25%? Why is there not something closer to parity with the representation of women in the country and women as voters? So given the day of the week, sometimes I feel like we've made this great progress. And sometimes I feel like there are so many obstacles and so much further that we need to go. We do have a situation now where 3 women have been nominated for the vice presidency, and one of them is won. We do have a situation where Nancy Pelosi served twice as Speaker of the House and as one of the most skilled and influential Speakers of the House in American history. We do have a situation where women now serve in positions of leadership, generally in Congress. I think 7 women are in President Biden's cabinet. And if you look at congressional committees where a lot of the work of government is done, you see women increasingly gaining the powerful seat of chair of a committee or the ranking member. And this all matters it's more than a numbers game, because many women have different priorities and different ways of operating than men do. That's not true of every woman and every man, but it is true with some broad strokes that the attention paid to issues like childcare and education and healthcare, attention to those issues gets bigger the more women who are at the table. And the collaboration and cooperation across the aisle is statistically and in a common sense way better among women than it is among men. We've seen this, we've had a situation in the past 2 years where the appropriations committees, which is incredibly, hey, how you doing? The appropriations committees, which are incredibly powerful committees in Congress, both of them in the House and Senate have had women as their chair and their ranking member, and that's been marked by more collaboration and more willingness to reach a deal as opposed to have a showdown than we've seen in other committees of Congress. Let me talk just for a moment before I stop about what's happened with women in journalism and politics, because we've also seen big changes with that. When I came here in 1979, there was no Washington bureau of more than one person that had a woman bureau chief. And if you look at things now, USA Today has a woman Washington bureau chief, the New York Times does, NPR does, the Washington Post has a woman as the executive editor of the paper. If you look at the Sunday network morning shows, the Sunday morning shows on the networks, which are a very prestigious post for women in TV broadcasting, 3 of the 4 are anchored by women at CBS, at Fox, and at NBC. So things have changed in such big ways since I arrived here, in such good ways, and I feel actually pretty lucky to have been here during that. So let me stop, and they're miking up Sonya.
Hey, Susan.
Hey, it's so nice to see you. I haven't seen you in so long.
It's good to see you too.
Sonya, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I introduced Susan. I'm going to take a minute to introduce you if you don't mind.
Okay.
So Sonya Ross now she is the founder and editor-in-chief of Black Women Unmuted, which is devoted to raising the voices and stories of Black women, specifically in politics. Before that, she was Emmy at Inside Climate News, but the bulk of her career was 33 years at the Associated Press. She was the first Black woman to get the White House beat. She basically created the race beat and really formed how they've approached that coverage. She was made part of the SPJ Hall of Fame in 2018, and last year received the WABJ Legacy Award. Like Susan, she has traveled all over the world, 48 countries, I believe.
48, yeah.
And so, a lot of similarities between these two, really, both covering women in politics, but also kind of, forging a path for women journalists as well. So with that, Sonya, I'm going to let you say a bit since we've got to hear from Susan. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I feel so fortunate to be sitting next to Susan Page. I don't think we can ever say enough about how much you've done for women in journalism, and how that I was listening to you in the 30 microseconds that they were wiring me up, and you were talking about 1979 and being here to see all these changes in this town, and you were at the fore of a whole lot of that change, and so I'm grateful to be here. I was this little green person on the White House beat, looking up at Susan and other women there, so I feel really gratified to be here. Now, what do you want? What else do you need me to talk about?
Do you want to talk a little bit about, why, because we've been having these conversations all week, why did you want to found Black Women Unmuted? Like, what were you seeing not covered in mainstream media that made you want to do that?
Well, it was really mainstream media coverage that made me want to do that. I was sitting in the AP watching an amazing thing happen in Alabama in 2017 in the special election for the U.S. Senate. And Democratic voters there sent a Democrat back to the Senate for the first time in a generation. Richard Shelby was a little bit of a technicality. I mean, he had been elected as a Democrat. But what I saw in the exit poll data was that black women in particular in Alabama gave 98% support for the Democrat, Doug Jones, 2% support for the Republican Roy Moore, and no shenanigans, no blank spots, no write-in candidates, none of that. That usually make up about 1 or 2% of the electorate. When you look at other demographics, there was something like 1% of white women did a write-in, 2% of white men did a write-in, something like 2% of black men did a write-in. Not the black women. They said vote hard or stay home. And because of that, Doug Jones won. I mean, there were, when I talk to people about this, and this gets into intersectionality a good bit. When I talk to people about this, black men say, yeah, but you know what? He had 93% support from black people. And I said, but let me see my math. 98% exceeds 93%, and women are the majority of human beings on the planet. So somehow it wasn't special, or that these women could not have achieved that without the men, which we know was not true. God loved the men, but no. So I said, that needs to be explored to greater depth and specificity. So the media did cover that. It was Washington Post exit poll data that showed me that. But what didn't get covered was the following year when there were 70 black women running for office in Alabama. And I said, well, why was that? Running for an array of offices too, some statewide races. And I said, why was that? And yet, because of the times we were in and media resources being so thin, there was not bandwidth to cover that. I mean, media budgets had to focus on the amazing weirdness that was going on with Donald Trump's presidency. And because newsrooms were tight and getting tighter and news deserts were expanding, there just wasn't space and time for that. So I said, well, what if someone with seasoning took themselves out of the Donald Trump chase and tried to focus on that? Because that couldn't have been happening in isolation. That had to have been happening for a reason. And what happened after that? Hey, I looked into some more stuff, and there were 7 of the country's largest 100 cities had black women mayors. And I said, well, is that a coincidence or what? And so I just kept digging and found just this trove of activity, political activity by black women, running for office, pushing people to the polls, influencing strategy. And I said, there's a revolution going on here that needs to be documented. So like any good reporter, I just said, let's try to focus on that. So I chased down a microspec of money, and I do mean teeny amount of money, and launched Black Women Unmuted in 2019 to start focusing on that. And the irony is, as I was trying to get this off the ground, the activity kept leveling up. These women kept right on pushing and moving. And what we're looking at now is a black woman as the sitting vice president of the United States. A black woman ascended to the U.S. Supreme Court. And all of that was like subtext to the notion that politics is a girl's game too. And I said, that's gotta be covered. And so we're still out here trying to do it. We've pivoted to panel discussions where we talk about things that are impacting Black women in politics, and we have another one coming soon about Black women seeking statewide offices, which is a hindrance and a problem. Getting elected is tough. And so to me, it's good old-fashioned American journalism like any other. And it is an aspect of political journalism that doesn't always get explored. So,
you talked about this, but a question for both of you. So when conversations are happening, whether it's about a female candidate or a woman politician, someone who's already elected and kind of what they're doing, how have conversations in the newsroom changed? You both have a career that spans the past few decades. How have is there work that you used to have to do just to kind of have the conversation that you no longer have to do? Are there problems that you're still seeing?
I think the fact that there are more women in the newsroom working as reporters and more women in executive positions directing coverage makes a big difference. Because, of course, we're trained as mainstream journalists to not be representing anybody but the public's right to know about important things that are happening. You're not trying to put some spin on it, but you bring your own life experience there. So when you have a woman covering a woman candidate, she may be less likely to ask some kind of boneheaded question about what you're wearing. And it doesn't mean that never happens anymore, but I think the playing field gets more level as more women are covering politics as well as running for office.
I would agree with that. I always think of it in terms of the era before the cigarette smoke cleared out of the newsrooms and the era after the cigarette smoke, because it's really, how do I put this? It is really that the nation is transforming. And so, like anybody else, you have to keep the game in pace with the transformation. So some of it is just responding to transformation. But Susan's absolutely right. Lived experience matters. And sometimes there is resistance to your lived experience informing your journalism, and immediately up pops bias, or you're biased because of this or that. Well, having a uterus does not make you biased about politics if you're sitting there listening to things that impact women in a certain way, and you know that because you're a woman. That can't possibly be bias. That is informed, lived experience governing how you cover something. Otherwise, you have this homogenous approach to journalism that forces you to suppress that, when suppression is not always the best thing for that set of facts.
We talk about how things have gotten better in many ways, and they have, but social media is like a wayback machine to another era.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the amount of harassment to women politicians and women journalists on social media is quite extraordinary, and a lot of it is just like, I can't tell you how many times I get tweets that, why don't you smile more? Or,
oh my God,
you smile too much, try to smile less, but usually in rougher language than that. And so social media is like this challenge that women in positions of authority or prominence or just public view, whether they're in journalism and politics, really have to figure out how to deal with and how to ignore, mostly, because you're probably not going to convert some of these people to think twice about what they're saying. And I do not think, Kevin, maybe he can tell us, I do not think men get that many comments about whether they smile too much or not enough. I think it's kind of a woman's thing.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Or they get this,
yeah.
They come with this, can I get a smile?
Yeah.
No, I don't owe you that.
Right. No.
Get out of here. I just, Twitter is, I've just turned it into this place. I go in there every now and then. I don't have anything. I ignored the toxins so thoroughly that they decided I'm not going to get a rise out of her, and now they leave me alone. But every now and then I would dip in there and say, look, don't be angry with me because you're mad at your mama. I didn't do it or whatever. And or just, there was one particular guy that I just said, I'm just going to ask him questions until he gets sick of me and cusses me out or something. You know, I said, have you always been this way, or is it learned behavior? Like what? And at first he was thinking I was really trying to answer him, you know, and then he said, oh, you're just effing with me and F you. And, oh, okay. I'll be here if you have any more questions.
I have a million more questions, but let's open it up to the fellows. Rachel has it.
Okay. Yeah, share the wealth. I wanted to ask about the issue of, we had a session on threats and harassment. And I think one of the things that the journalists kept referring to so often was, we want to tell these stories, but we don't want to put women in danger. We don't want to make them uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
We want to know how far to go and when to push back, et cetera. So I think this is an incredible opportunity for the women in this room to get some advice from you on how to create a strategy for trying to tell those stories, knowing when to pull back, or when it's actually important to hear about what's going on.
I was going to defer to you, Susan.
Well, I think you shouldn't put yourself in danger, but you also shouldn't respond to every crackpot. And so there have been a few times I've gotten kind of specific threats that I've reported to USA Today, which they've taken seriously. A couple years ago, somebody was shipping weird things to my home address, which I think was mostly like dog food, which I assume was meant as a big insult. And like not inexpensive things, so it was perplexing. And I just, I gave him to like a pet shelter. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So if you actually feel threatened, you need to take it seriously. But if somebody's just mouthing off, I'd say roll it off your back, ignore it, block them. People who are obscene or threatening to me on social media, I'll block. And people who are just like constantly haranguing me as being incompetent or ugly or something, I'll mute. Because that way, when you block somebody, they can tell you blocked them. When you mute somebody, they think they're screaming at you, but you're not hearing them. So that's kind of satisfying. So I think you need to be responsive to threats, but I think you got to have kind of a tough skin. You got to have a tough skin on social media threats, and also when the sources yell at you, or when people you've covered yell at you, or think you haven't done a fair job. You need to. I mean, it's like part of the job of doing journalism. So you need to figure out whether it's a real threat or just someone who is a crackpot and you should ignore. What do you think?
Exactly that. And there's been research. Michelle Ferrier has magnificent research about how much online harassment is out there, and Black women specifically get targeted a lot. And I've been targeted, and I can't possibly know where it's going to come from or how, and so I'm like, I can't worry about something I can't control like that. When they do surface, like Susan, block game on strong, mute game on strong, but I also am very aware that there is a desire to run you out. That what they want is for you to stop doing what you're doing, to stop covering what you're covering, to change your voice and agree with them, and denying them the satisfaction of getting me to do that keeps me going. Yes. I'm not going anywhere. I stand right between you and what you want published, and you've got to go through me, buddy. and I'm not going to go away, because there's always somebody, and some of these people are actually in the newsroom with you, but they want you to go away. So just the pure refusal to go away does more than you would think.
Well, the second layer of that is, and I promise I'll let y'all to speak soon. The second layer of that is, journalists who want to get politicians, women politicians, to talk about harassment. Putting, our responsibility to say, this is a story that needs to be told. Would you talk about what happened to you? We had Sadaf Jaffer speak about her experiences in New Jersey and how she's not running again until her children are older and she'll feel safer. So what advice would you give journalists who want to try to tell the stories of women politicians about how to approach them and how to put together a strategy?
Adjust to what they're saying, first of all. If they're saying, I've got my kids and I got to think about that, you adjust to that and say, okay, well, you know what? We don't have to do this right now, or we don't have to do this way. We can come up with other ways of doing that. We can come up with other ways of covering that. We've had to actually adjust around that. We have a series we're doing now with some student journalists at Georgia State University around these black women mayors in about like 5 bedroom communities around Atlanta. And I said, there are 5 suburbs with black women mayors? Like, where does that ever happen? And these women are like, I don't have time to talk to you, to every attempt that we've made. So we are now in the phase of, we're going to do a story. How can we get you in it? And I just try to adjust to where they're coming from, because I understand the concern. I wouldn't want anybody coming after my kid either. I don't have kids, but if I had a kid, I wouldn't want anybody coming after my kids like that either. I wouldn't want someone threatening my family. I wouldn't want any of that. But I also am aware they know that, and so they do this to try to thwart the coverage. So we just pivot into another strategy to try to respect where they're coming from.
There's a real impact to this too, and that one reason there are fewer women in office is because women are less likely to run for office, and they're more likely to wait until they're a little older to run for office than men are. And one reason is the harassment that you get when you're in office. Nancy Pelosi, for instance, she was 47 before she ran for office the first time, and her youngest of her 5 children was a senior in high school then. So she waited. A lot of women do that. So it has an impact on women's willingness to get engaged in the political process, because you take so much grief when you're out there.
Mm-hmm. Any questions?
Hi, my name is Samia Kamal. I'm with Cal Matters in California. I feel like something we're hearing today and we've heard all week is like reality is more nuanced, but I think in writing stories, journalism is still like keep the story simple. Don't try to keep it straightforward. Go with one theme in a story, and I think that doesn't always capture reality as well. So I'm wondering if you have seen that change, or if you have any tips for how to add more nuance to a story without losing readers.
I can't say this would work for everyone. It did work for me. Well, it was trial and error, but I was forever throwing something new up against the wall just to see what kind of pattern it made and if it would work. I experimented a lot in pushing the boundaries of where the coverage could go, just so I could understand where there was room for growth and change. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it worked more often than it didn't. So right now, with the state of media, it's a huge playground, and you can experiment to see what might work and what doesn't. What if I tried this to get that story? Or what if I said it this way? There will always be a standard bearer who will say, no, you can't do that. That's just impossible. No, you can't do that. But it's easier to experiment around the no than it is to let the no limit everything you do. You got to try. Nothing beats a failure but a try. And so if I were magically catapulted back chronologically in age to where I'm sitting in a room like you are now, I would play around with it I would do that exact same thing. I would say, let me see where there's flexibility and where I can push the envelope to take coverage further in a new direction. And while it might not work in this year, it might work 3 years from now, or it will point up what the flaw was in that plan. When I came in to my career in the 80s, one thing that always happened was you got your story idea and went to your editor and said, can I do this? Right? And I would come with story ideas. I was doing what was called urban affairs, which was a euphemism for race. Like now we just say race, it's race. But back then, even the notion that a story might be racial in nature was like, no, we aren't gonna do that. So I got told no a lot. And I said, I gotta find a way around this thing. And what I would do was just pretend I had permission to go do this. And it usually involved chasing something down when I was off work or while I was working a desk trick or the overnight. So when I went back to my editor and said, here's a story, and explain it, if I heard even a scintilla of a yes, then it was bam, here's the story. I've done it. There you go. And I called it guerrilla reporting, almost like guerrilla warfare. And what happened was they said, well, she'll deliver the story when she brings it up, so let's just let it happen. And that led to coverage that kept us out front on stories well before they actually developed, So when they would develop, while other papers were trying to get up to speed on it, we were already moving. But it took stretching those boundaries and pushing those envelopes and finding a way around the no. So it takes experimentation is the short answer to that long explanation.
Let me just disagree with what you're hearing from some editors, that reality is black and white, choose one theme, make a story one-dimensional. I think that is the worst possible advice you can get. Because reality is never black and white. Reality is always shades of gray. It's always complicated. There are always nuances. And the best stories acknowledge that. Even a story where it's even a story about something reprehensible or that you totally find unacceptable, like election deniers. Even those stories need to have a sense of nuance and the voices of those who are denying the election, because that's part of the reality that you're covering, and that's part of stories that are both more convincing and more compelling and smarter, and that are more fulfilling of the kind of the mission that journalists have. One of the things that dismays me at the moment is we're so politically polarized as a nation that I feel like there are journalists writing for one side or the other without acknowledging the other side. And that's true. That's certainly true for the right-wing media, but it's true for some mainstream and leftist publications as well, that do not acknowledge grievances that we're hearing from citizens, that are not acknowledging the core of the fact that Donald Trump continues to have support from Americans who believe that the election was stolen, even though that's been proven to be not the case, or believe that Biden is behind his prosecution at the moment in a New York courtroom. We're not going to reach a whole bunch of readers we need to reach if we don't acknowledge that there are people with other views and other sides, and we treat them with respect. I mean, I think back to the mistake after every election. I always feel like, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I see that? Why didn't I understand that? I always end an election, I don't know if you feel this way, thinking, man, I really screwed this up. I need to do better. And after the 2016 election, I especially felt that way, because I felt like we hadn't listened hard enough to people who were saying, Donald Trump is not a joke to me. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Or even weren't saying they were going to vote for him, but in private we're going to. So that's good journalism is never simple or one-dimensional?
Well, I'm Kayla Harris from the San Antonio Express News. I think you turned it off. Oh, okay, great. And I have a reporting question. I'm wondering if you have any advice for piercing the boys club that exists in a lot of political environments and how you get lawmakers to take you as seriously as your male colleagues.
Why don't you go first?
Show up. Just show up. I have a fun. Here's an example of that, and it's hilarious to me still. I was covering the NAACP. They were having this big meeting about whether Louis Farrakhan, who I don't know how many of you have heard of Louis Farrakhan, but he's a controversial figure, and definitely outside of the mainstream of civil rights thought. And the then chairman of the NAACP wanted to mainstream him, bring him in, and they had this big meeting. And I was there, and I was there along with Lynn Duke, who was from the Washington Post, and we were the only two women journalists in the pack of people covering this thing. And Lynn and I were talking to each other when the chairman stepped off the dais into a clutch of men and the male reporters, and none of them did the proper to us, like, which they would do for their own. So Lynn said, I think this gathering needs some estrogen, and walked right up into the middle of it, and I followed her. She was very petite, and I'm tall, and so she wormed in where I had the elbow in. But that happens sometimes. You have to always keep your eye on those men, especially the ones they golf with. Susan, I don't know if you've ever been invited to a golf round with any of those White House folks.
Of course, I don't play golf, so.
I don't either. And some of the guys never played golf,
very
but they were always getting invited to those kinds of things. So you just have to elbow your way in there. If I would hear about a golf outing, I'd go to and say, I don't play golf. But let's get some coffee. I mean, the Clinton staff, they were especially notorious about that. Let's go play golf. And I had to say, you know what? I heard you guys went to play golf, and I don't play golf. So what do I get, right? And you do have to nose your way in. Keeping an eye on the guys. That's what Lynn did in that setting, kept an eye on certain guys who were getting leaks. I circumvented those leaks by going to the people who get underestimated all the time. You'd be amazed at what the administrative assistants and the lower staff are privy to. And they are never considered viable as sources because they're not high enough up on the echelon. But they handle all the paperwork. They are in the room, and their eyes and ears work too. So again, which kind of goes back to your question earlier about how you circumvent. You just push the envelope and experiment a little bit and find alternative sources. And when it's necessary, elbow your way right on into that throng, because they forget sometimes that we're in the room.
Yeah. When I was covering the Reagan White House, there were only two women covering the White House as a beat for newspapers, and that was me and Ann Devroy, who worked who was the greatest reporter I've ever known. Mm-hmm. Not the happiest person, kind of mean, but she was.
I think politics made her mean.
Well, but she was a phenomenal reporter.
She was.
Anyway, so and then she worked for the Washington Post, and she and I were the only two women on the beat. Mm-hmm. And it was like the men in the White House could not keep us straight, even though it's not like we look so much alike. It was like our only thing was we were both women who worked for newspapers, and this was apparently baffling. So once I was at a news conference with the elder President Bush, and he called on me as Ann, which I ignored and just asked my question. And then he put Ann in his answer like 6 times, like, well, Ann, I think blah, blah, blah. And people in the News Corps started to laugh. And Bush had no idea why people were laughing, so he finished. And I was, it doesn't matter. He can call me whatever he wants, as long as he calls on me. And he was leaving, and he asked Marlon Fitzwater, why were they laughing? And he said, it's Susan. There was another time that my husband, Carl Loopsdorff, was also covering the White House then for the Dallas Morning News. And when we went on trips, and we were both on the trip, we would stay in the same hotel room because we were married, right? So there was a trip he went on that I didn't go on, and he checks into his room, and he opens the hotel room, and there's Ann Devroy, because they put her in the same room with him on the theory that, I guess, Carl Loopsdorff stays with whoever the woman is, who knows. So this was kind of a hurdle to get people to actually understand that there were two of us, and we were different. It's better now than it was, but it's still not perfect, and my theory has always been, just plow ahead. So, especially when I was a young reporter, a rather junior reporter, I would always show up to news conferences and sit in the front row, and I'd ask a question. I would ask a question even if I didn't have a question to ask, because I wanted them to call on me and see me there. And I would, I would do all if there was a woman in a position of power, I would definitely try to cultivate her as a source, but also, just cultivate people as sources without playing golf with them, or without, the first presidential campaign I covered in '80, I was routinely the only woman on the bus, and none of the men ever thought to include me in their dinner plans, which was unfortunate. Actually, only two men ever thought maybe Susan would like to go to dinner too, and one of them was Carl Loopsdorff, so I married him.
Well, it's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same, because let's fast forward to the son of Daddy Bush when he was president of the United States. And right at the beginning of his term, he came in, this is W we talking about, right? W comes in, and there was a wire service clatch, which they would do an off the record, get to know you kind of thing. And I'm the only woman in the room. I'm the only black person in the room. And when he came through the door, he came straight to me. And he was talking to me, and I was talking to him. The photographer captured this moment. My colleague, Ron Fournier, is standing there patiently waiting to talk to him. Probably a little irked that he came to me first, I don't know. But we were talking, and he said, I'm going to have to give you a nickname. Oh. And I said, well, Mr. President, if you give me a nickname, I'm going to have to give you one. And from that moment on, he never forgot my name, which was the nightmare for Sandra Soberai, my colleague. We could not look more different. No. Whatever I'm looking like right now, just go polar opposite. And that was Sandra. I mean, blonde hair, blue eyes, completely different people. He called her Sonya all the time, because Sonya, and I said, Sonya, Sandra, okay, they're kind of close, but no. Physically, we looked so different. There's no way that he would do that to Rob and Bob, right? Rob and Bob, he'd say, okay, I can tell the difference between these two, or Ron and Rob, or, Bill and Bob. But Sonya and Sandra, and poor Sandra Soberai got called Sonya for, I don't know, maybe 6 months or longer, which,
And you can't really correct the president.
You can't. She just had to take it.
Yeah, you just have to sit there and take it. That's right.
You have Shaylee, and then Julian, and then Ariana. Go this way.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah. I'm Shaylee. I'm with Montana Public Radio. Thanks for being here and talking with us. So we've been talking a lot over this week about how to cover women in politics, how to do that well, how to do it ethically, how to do it respectfully. And we've had some really, really good discussions. And there have been a number of times that I've been thinking, my male colleagues could really benefit from this too. And so I definitely plan to bring back what we've talked about to male reporters who I work with, who I think could do better. And I'm curious, I have found that that's sometimes hard to have the authority and confidence to have those conversations with them. I'm just curious if you have advice for working with male colleagues and higher ups about how to do this work and how to do it better?
It's a tough one.
It is. I wish there were a magic bullet for that. There's not. It's sort of situational. I guess
Yeah.
it depends case by case.
Depends on how offensive it is too.
Yeah.
A really offensive, something's truly racist, you should speak up. But there are casual offenses day and night in the workplace and in life, and I think my strategy has been to ignore those that can be ignored. I don't know, do you feel that way?
We call those microaggressions, right? And they pile up.
Yeah.
And so the longer you have to learn to keep a stiff upper lip and deal with it, the more of them stack up until you snap. And sometimes people, they want you to go off on them, and maybe that's the time to just let it fly. I mean, at the end of it all, you are human. And so it's not incumbent upon you to fix them.
That's a good point.
You just are going to have to do what you do and say, you can get on this train and ride, or it's going to leave you behind. You're going to get left behind. And a lot of these men who will not become progressive about it do get left behind, but they're not your problem. And it's not incumbent upon you to fix them. You can let them know why that's unacceptable and keep it moving. But the hard reality is that the microaggressions happen, so many of them you have to overlook, and they do stack up. So when it gets to a pressure point for you, hey, sometimes you may have to tell off a person. You're just gonna have to tell them off and say, no, don't you ever go there with me again, because you don't want that. That smoke you don't want. And that gets rid of the pressure and makes room for the microaggressions to stack up all over again. I mean, it's just the reality of being a woman in these spaces.
There's really, women have different strategies about it. And when I started at Newsday, which was my first job, like the week before I started, there was a class action lawsuit, federal lawsuit filed by the women at Newsday about sexism in the newsroom, because no woman had ever been a foreign correspondent, no woman had ever been sent to Washington, no woman had ever been sent to Albany. And so these women stood up and protested. And thank God they did, because I benefited enormously from their willingness to do that. But they paid a real price. Mm-hmm. And the women, I got sent to Albany, not the women who had filed the lawsuit. I was too late to file the lawsuit. I could have joined it. I could not have joined the lawsuit. It was about a period before I started. I got sent to Washington, not one of the women who had filed the lawsuit. The women who benefited from what those brave women did were not the ones who did it. And I think that often happens, that you pay, if you're willing to stand up, you often pay a price, and it's sometimes worth it and sometimes necessary. But it's one reason I've had kind of in general the plow ahead theory of life, and to respond only when it is so egregious that it would be immoral for you not to say, stop that. But women have different, you got to figure out what works for you and what you're comfortable doing.
Yeah, I came into the AP like you. I was too late. Similarly, there was a lawsuit brought by women, actually on behalf of women and people of color. But at the time, there weren't enough people of color in the AP. Actually, it was a black woman who brought the initial action, but they put the two together because there were more women available to build the class, you see. And out of that came the internship program through which I was hired. And what happened? Well, as the years went by, I ended up becoming a plaintiff myself. So, yeah, it's a sacrifice when you are the one. This is why I say it's not incumbent upon you to fix them, but sometimes when you are confronted with the ability to do the right thing, you have to ask yourself, what is the right thing here? Do I do the right thing? And be prepared for what that means, because it means sacrifice in most cases, But the satisfaction in it is that you've made a way possible for others. And that's the joy in it. Right.
I would also just hop in, and if part of the issue is not being able to cover the things that you want to cover or in the way that you want to cover them, when you get something done that you're proud of, not just saying like, hey, I did this great thing, but like come with the receipts. So like look at the traffic that it does, like look at the social media response to it. Especially, if you don't have access to this, you can ask like the social media manager where you are, like they can look at specific audience things. So you can say, we are reaching a new audience that you need. And so I think that can also, I mean, there's obviously the ethics of it of like, it's right to cover everybody, but you can also just play the numbers game. Ariama? Oh, I'm sorry, Julian.
Hi, my name's Julianne McShane. I'm with Mother Jones. I wanted to ask about this point that you made about like covering the upcoming election and quoting election deniers. Can you say more about, how you do that, given what we saw with January 6th and the general threat to democracy or significance to democracy that this election poses? Can you say more about practically, how you'd recommend doing that, or do you think there's a way to cover this sort of ethos without actually quoting these people? And then also, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on NBC News firing Ronna McDaniel or rescinding her employment because of this exact reason. And full disclosure, I used to work for NBC News, not recently, not when that all went down, unfortunately for me, because I would have liked to hear what was happening.
So that's a great question, something we struggle with. I think it's important to treat people, including election deniers, with respect, and to quote them, of course, and to listen to them, and to figure out where they're coming from. It's a huge part of the electorate. It's like 30% of the electorate doesn't believe the election was legitimately decided. That's not insignificant. That is not just a fringe. That is a big fraction of the electorate. So we need to cover them. But we don't want to repeat lies. And so we pursue what we call a truth sandwich. Do you know what a truth sandwich is? You all do? Yeah. It's like you don't let a lie stand. You tell the truth, you tell the lie, you tell the truth. So that no one can get to the lie without going through the truth. And that's true not just in stories, but that's true in headlines and cut lines and everything we do. You do not restate a lie without stating the truth. And I think this is important and an important safeguard, even though for some election deniers it convinces them the mainstream media has a bias against them because we are constantly saying unfounded accounts or debunked accounts or whatever. So I think it's important to do both things. It's important to listen to them and cover them, but not to let a lie stand unchallenged. On the Ronna McDaniel thing, I think it is important to have voices in news media accounts, but I don't think it's important to pay them $600,000 a year to do so. So I would put a difference between being willing to interview her about her views on things and putting her on your payroll. What did you think about that?
I agree. I mean, I agree with the point you made as someone who was making well under that amount of money and who was on a contract at NBC News and, I got great feedback and things, but when the end of my contract came, I was told, sorry, if you want to stay, you can apply for the overnight reporter role. And I just felt like I didn't want to do that. And So looking at it externally, frustrating for that reason. There's so many journalists losing their jobs, right? That amount of money could keep so many journalists employed. I was surprised at the intensity of the on-air pushback.
It was a gift to Chuck Todd.
Right.
Chuck Todd on his way out, here he goes out. Not that it wasn't brave what he said, but also good for him. It was helpful to him. To be very principled.
But I think I agree with your point that they can have these people on air to quote and give commentary, but I mean, Rachel Maddow made a good point, which is like in her on-air rant where she said if we're actually employing this person, every time we bring her on or quote her, if we're talking about the 2020 election, we're going to have to acknowledge that she denied it. She denied the results, and she was an election denier, and is, named in the papers on this and that kind of thing. So,
and Kristen Welker did exactly the right thing, I thought, in Rana's brief appearance as a paid commentator, in that she just challenged her right and left and wouldn't let her off the hook. And for her to say that she was an election denier not because she really thought it, but because it was like her job. So now it's her job to not be an election denier. So why should we believe her analysis on anything? But Kristen took her seriously and wouldn't let her off the hook. And I thought that was exactly the right thing to do.
There's also one thing that everyone here is going to have to keep in mind, and that is the role media plays in the overall political strategy of the far right, or the MAGA wing, or whatever you want to call that. Media is a big part of that strategy. And that means the antipathy toward the media, characterizing media as less than credible, not inclined to believe them. And so you have to bear in mind how much of what they're doing or saying while you're reporting your story plays to that strategy. Ronna McDaniel's presence in NBC also was strategic, in addition to being, it wasn't just media strategy, it wasn't just NBC's strategy to bring her in there. And hats off to her, for she was able to get that chunk of money out of them to do virtually nothing. And so you have to think, where does this play in their strategy? And thinking about the strategy, like, educate yourself on what's exactly in that Project 2025 document, for example, and say, where does this play in the strategy on everything from someone like Ronna McDaniel to when you are talking to your average, everyday, red hat, make America great again person. Where does this narrative or talking points, and how much of that am I hearing consistently from everybody? Because that informs your reporting. So keep the strategy in mind also while you're gathering from these folks. Arguing with them is pointless. Don't do it. Let them say whatever they're going to say. Sometimes they'll say things that they feel will hurt you, so that they can get their point across through shock value. Don't be shocked. Let it do what it do, as they say. But keep in mind always, I've heard this talking point about 15 times. So that's a strategic thing. That's not necessarily this particular voter. And I mean, that was something that could have been useful in Atlanta when former President Trump showed up at a Chick-fil-A on what was supposed to be an impromptu stop. And if you've covered politics, you know, the whole thing is always staged. It is always a staged thing. Even, you know, it's the unstaged things. You know it's unstaged when you're there like, oh my God, he said he wants to stop for ice cream and everybody's got to run. That's impromptu. But planned, strategic appearance at a Chick-fil-A to buy 30 milkshakes for Black people who spontaneously showed up to support him. There was more to that story. But if you're privy to the strategy and you're privy to the talking points, you understand there's something else going on here. It isn't just this woman stepping forth to say, we love you, President Trump, and we're going to support you to the end. And if you know anything about Black people in that particular part of Atlanta, you know, that sounds strange to me. Let me see if I can go one block up the street and find a different person. Always bear in mind at what point the media play is part of the strategy.
You get the last question. Yep.
Hi, I'm Ariama from Amsterdam News, and just for like background, I've only been covering politics for like 4 years, and I'm not like a poli-sci major or anything. So when I first started, I felt like an imposter syndrome, questioning like political systems, and I felt like I always got backlash from editors like, well, this is just how we cover polls, or this is just how we cover judicial elections. I was like, that's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. this seems really secretive or like excluding a bunch of people and voters. So I felt like I always came from that perspective, and I was curious if you guys had that same experience maybe earlier on in your career, or just questioning how things were always done, like in your newsroom.
I did. Do you?
I had this put on blinders, just plow ahead. I mean, that's just my general strategy in life, not for everybody. But, you know, there's imposter syndrome is not helpful, so give it up, right? Just like that.
Yeah, give it up.
Just give it up. Just, you're there for a reason. You do what you think is right. You stand up for yourself. And do not agonize over whether you deserve to be there or how you got there. That has been my general approach.
The very fact that you were not some school political scientist made you valuable in that setting. So yeah, like Susan said, give up the imposter syndrome. You could have walked in there with a PhD
Absolutely.
in political science, and
Screw
they
them.
still
Who
would
are
have
they
done
anyway?
that to you. Yeah, because they know the way. So you actually got a complex blend of newbie on the block and mansplaining in the way that you got handled about that. But some of it was meant to be a learning experience. Yeah, it is necessary to understand the way polls work and the way they do things about it. But being the clean slate means the parts that you say, well, that doesn't make sense, automatically say there's got to be a better way to do it than that. Because then you're bringing your living experience informed knowledge to the table. That's knowledge. That's not just, I don't understand it. What it was is knowledge. When you automatically said, that doesn't make sense, you had knowledge to apply that could make it make sense. You know, not every political journalist comes from a political background. I mean, look at April Ryan, classic example. April Ryan came to the White House during the Clinton administration from Morning Zoo Radio in Baltimore, which couldn't be more different. No state house experience, no political campaign experience, none of that. And she had an awful lot to learn, but she also had an awful lot to bring to the table to make the conversation different. So, yeah, she learned the ropes. You're always going to learn the ropes, no matter what background you're bringing to the table. So let go of the imposter syndrome and treat what you're questioning like that's informed knowledge. That's not ignorance.
It's easier than you think.
Mm-hmm.
And Sandra, Susan, Sonya, thank you so much.